Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Evening came, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far from land. Very early in the morning, he came to his disciples walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." They were so frightened they screamed. But just then Jesus spoke to them. "Be encouraged, it's me, don't be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened, and he began to sink, and he shouted, "Lord, rescue me!" Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" When they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's Son." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So I imagine you've all heard the joke or some variant thereof. The joke about the priest, the rabbi, and the disciples minister who decided to go fishing. So they rowed out into the boat, and they're getting ready to begin, and the rabbi goes, I should have gone to the restroom, give me just a minute. Gets up, steps out of the boat, scurries along to shore, disappears, comes back, waltzes across the water, back into the boat. And the priest goes, I'd forgotten too. My tackle box is on the shore. Give me a minute. I'm going to go get it. Steps out, and the priest scurries along the water, hits the shore, grabs his tackle box, turns around, and gracefully glides back across the water and steps into the boat. And at this point, the disciples' minister is looking at them going, "Wow, I wonder if I could do that." So he makes up his excuse and says, "You know what, I got to go to the bathroom too." And being a good disciple minister, winds himself up, stands up, takes that first step off the boat, and sploosh. And of course, at that moment, the rabbi just looks over at the priest and goes, "Think we should tell him where the stones are?" It's been told in many ways and in many forms, and I never get tired of making fun of myself and my kind when I tell it, but I thought it was a good way to start today, this idea of knowing where the stones are, right? Because the joke in our story today is kind of on Peter at this point. Obviously, he didn't know where the stones were, or at least that's kind of how the story plays it out. This whole idea of if he just stepped out on faith and if it had been a little bit stronger, he wouldn't have fallen in. But is that really what's going on here? Is this really a joke at Peter's expense, or is there something bigger at play in this story? I like to rag on Peter. It's not hard to do if you've read your stories about him. The zealot who becomes a denier by the end of the evening. The guy who saw transfiguration and then completely blew it by trying to freeze them in that moment on the mountain. The one who drew his sword in the garden when Jesus says, no, 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 we're not here to fight. There are a lot of ways we can do that, and frankly, at my last call, serving in a church that bore the name St. Peter, I had a lot of fun with this guy. And you know, maybe this is just one more moment to get after him. One more moment where Peter stands up with bravado and says, if you call me out, Lord, I will come. And so Jesus does. And we know how it ends. Maybe not quite as dramatic as the disciple minister, but it was just about a sploosh. And it ends with Jesus going, you man of weak faith, as he pulls Peter up out of the water. But I can't help but wonder. If Peter isn't actually getting a bum rap here. Because this story of Jesus walking out to the disciples in the boat on the water, it does appear in the other Gospels, two of them, Mark and John, but in neither of those does Peter end up calling out to him and saying, invite me onto the water with you. It doesn't happen. Just here in Matthew. And for those of you who've been here the last few weeks, you know that sometimes I have some questions about Matthew's maybe efforts to embellish a little bit on the story to tell the meaning and the values that Matthew wants you to hear. And I've got to wonder if Matthew isn't just making an example of Peter here, using him to tell his story about what it means to be faithful. Because let's be honest, Peter has made himself an easy target for this. If there is a guy who ends up putting his foot in his own mouth in the Gospels more than Peter, I'm waiting for someone to show me. He is the one who is quick to proclaim something and then get caught doing the exact opposite. But you know, I have trouble with this story. And I'll tell you what, I'm not sure it was a question of his faith. I think the faith part comes afterward, because if you ask me, I think he was always supposed to fall in. It was never about him walking on the water. That was Jesus' job. In fact, if you sniff around too closely, you might catch just a whiff of heresy here. This idea that if Peter just had a strong enough faith, he could save himself out on these restless waves. And we all know better than that, don't we? This isn't an issue of whether our faith is good enough or our works are good enough or anything that we can do that is good enough that we are going to save ourselves. This should be a story about knowing that Jesus was in arm's length to pull him up when he started to sink. I know it says in other places in our scriptures that with the faith of a mustard seed, surely we could move mountains, and maybe that's true. But when it's our own lives that are on the line, is faith going to be enough? Is it something we will do on our own? I started with baptism this morning with the young folks because I wanted to talk about that, but I also was hoping I would plant a seed for you all, that some of you might begin to think and remember your own baptisms. Bless you. And I know that not all of us were immersed in the way that we do it here. In fact, I had the privilege and honor of baptizing a couple of infants at my previous call in the United Church of Christ. If you haven't seen it, it's kind of a large bowl-like font that you use to pull water out of it, and then you can sprinkle it over the baby. They all looked at me really funny when I looked at the bowl the first time and said, how am I supposed to immerse the infant in that? But for those of you who have experienced that and remember it, there's something about that baptism story, this idea of entering into the waters and going underneath them and being pulled back up. I know that maybe Matthew had something different in mind, but it's not the story that strikes me, because I find myself drawn more to our own traditional baptismal theology. You see this in the writings of Alexander Campbell, and he's just borrowing it from Paul. Romans 6, we are baptized into the death of Christ so that we might arise with him. This idea that baptism means going in and under the waters, knowing that God will lift us back out. We're very fortunate that our baptismal rite isn't that we're going to fill this font and see if we can walk on it. There's a reason that every minister I know has a pair of hip waders hidden somewhere back there, Because not one of us yet has ever passed that test, no matter how hard we might try. We just don't seem to know where the stones are hidden. But I'm reminded of this theology that we are drawn into the waters so that we might be drawn back up. Because it's not about being saved from death, it's being saved through death. Dying to and from all of the things that are holding us back. The sins in our lives, those things which weigh us down, the times that we step back and say, I cannot do this, or I cannot see a way forward. To die to those and rise again, resurrected out of the waters, embracing new life. For in that resurrection, we might also embrace a new vision for a new way of being, a clearer sight on what it is that God is calling each and every one of us to be and to do. At the end of the day, as Peter proves to us, there are no hidden stones to help us make it over the water. We all have to be willing to step out of the boat and to fall into the waters and trust that God will be there to fish us out. I've thought a lot about this in light of being here for 10-ish months at this point. I thought a lot in light of this about playing with this pastor's cabinet that I inherited and turning it into an experiment where we might start to dream about the future of our church. For those of you who are new or are visiting us, we're getting ready to celebrate 100 years here in 2019. So we're starting that first planning for how we will celebrate that. But this is also an important time to begin planning how we're going to live into the next 100 years that God is calling us to lead, to live, and to be. So you'll find some information in the newsletters. If you didn't get yours, I know Eleanor was handing them out beforehand, but they're available in the basket. There's extra copies for those who might want them. I'm also going to be offering some summaries of these meetings that we've had and the discussions we began. So if you'd like to see what we were talking about and get the basics, those will be available in the office. And I'm thinking about as well inviting folks into a book study. This came out of our last meeting of the pastor's experiment rather than cabinet. That we'd read the book Thrive, Spiritual Habits of Transforming Congregations, which was written by the regional minister of Montana. And she went around and she looked at congregations that were doing new and amazing things, hearing God's call in a new way, and conveniently wrote it down in book form so that we could learn from it. So there was some interest coming out of that meeting and sharing in that study. And if you, after hearing this and after seeing your newsette, decide that you're interested, I hope you'll come talk to me. Because in a way, we're approaching the end of 100 years so that we can step out of the boat and fall in. It's not like we can keep walking forward on top. It's time to die to the 100 years that we have so that we might be resurrected into the 100 years that God is calling us to live out next. That's exciting. It's also scary. Amen. But it's a good place to be when you know that no matter how far we fall in, the hand of the Christ is going to be waiting to pull us back up. Those of us who were immersed, we practice that in our baptisms. We're given the invitation to remember that when we have discussions and conversations like this. And we as a church, we're called to do the same thing as a group as well. I think we have a lot of work in front of us, but I think God has so much in mind for us as well. So we should ask, if it's really you, God, call us out of the boat. And then be prepared to sploosh. Because God is going to pull us up into something new and amazing and wonderful. I love Peter. Because at the end of the day, was he kind of a screw-up? I think that's a fair assessment. But by the end of our stories, we have Jesus telling him that you are the rock on which I will build my church. All we have to do is let go of whatever restrictions we have placed upon ourselves, whatever doubts we have set before us, whatever concerns are holding us back, and trust that God is calling us out of the boat to walk forward. In a moment, we're going to sing, Lord, You Have Come to the Lake Shore, as our communion hymn. And if you read through the verses, you'll hear it as a calling song that is actually much more closely tied to the calling of the disciples. Set aside your nets and follow me, and I will make you fishers for people. It takes place in Matthew chapter 4. But as we sing it today, I'm going to invite you to listen to it again and to reimagine it through the lens of this story that we heard today, of Peter hearing the call of God to go out into the storm and fall in. Imagine being called forth to walk on water as a resurrected people, doing things we have never imagined, seeking seas of which we have never dreamed, and going to places we've never imagined simply because God has called and we have decided to follow. And imagine that we do this, not in spite of our fears of the waves that may arise around us, but by embracing the very depths of our own baptisms, trusting that Christ will once more pull us up from the waters and into new life. As I said in the title, we dunk you at baptism for a reason, because it's your first reminder that when we fall into the waves, God is going to pull us up. We don't go in to swim, but to sink, trusting that resurrection will lead us to new and unimagined futures in Christ's name. So, is anyone else ready to go for a swim? Maybe it's time to dive in. Amen.